I'm trying to work out how long I've known him. It's a very long time. I always seem to ring him up when I need help, either to deal with, learn how to teach a particular idea, or sometimes I need him to do something really quick, like most recently we were working on analysis of the GCSE. So it'd be great to hand over now to one of our teachers.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Deborah. It's very nice to be here. And Deborah said to me, talk about a beautiful idea from as a Muslim from my own perspective. So I thought, okay, well, let's talk about jihad. Everyone else is talking about it. Okay. Right. So when I mention the word jihad, what comes to your mind? And when you see or hear this word, so maybe just kind of, you don't have to say it aloud, just think about what kind of things conjure up in your mind when you come across that word.
My name is Rasaman Baladas. I'm an educational consultant.
So it's an insider's perspective.
I follow a devotional tradition.
And the first point I want to make is the obvious: war is not a perpetual state. And the reason I want to begin with this is that whether it be the Islamophobic, the far right, or whether it's extremist Muslims who are interpreting the faith in a very extreme way to justify their political position. They're all using verses of the Quran. And I want you to remember, when they're quoting the Quran, it relates to a state of war. That's not a standard. Those verses are not about our interaction on a daily basis with one another. And always remember, so when it comes to war or conflict, there's verses about fighting relate to that. So war, of course, as you know, is not harmony, living peacefully with one another, respecting and tolerating and really looking after each other. That's the common sort of experience of human beings.
If you do have any questions, please make them up.
First things first, when I speak about Islam, this is how Islam itself defines it. The Prophet, peace be upon him, in a tradition, defined these means a way of life. He defined the religion, the way of life of Islam, as being based on three dimensions. It's a very famous hadith, a traditional called the Hadith of Jibreel. And so the first dimension is Islam, the second is Iman, the third is Islam. The first is submission to God, submission to Allah. The second Iman is about faith, and it's about defining who is Muslim, what it means to belong to the community of Muslims. What is the nature of God? How can we know God? How can we know the divine being? So these are kind of, this is the area of faith. And the third dimension of Ihsan, it's about doing that which is beautiful. So it is not sufficient to have submission to God. It is not just sufficient to have faith, but that has to translate into all that you do, that all your actions are beautiful. And when you're teaching Islam, often the 5 pillars, that's that's often taught in our schools. And for a long time I've argued that it's about the ethical and the moral dimension of Islam. That's the heart of Islam. It's not sufficient just to, what's the point of having just a faith? It has to translate into something that's beautiful. And this is at the heart of Islamic society. Muslims created a wonderful culture. Poetry, whether it's art, whether it's just the buildings that Muslims have created. They should symbolize something within which is beautiful. So that submission to God has to lead to that which is beautiful. And that really is what we will speak about in my short presentation to you. So ihsan, that's the third dimension. Doing that which is beautiful derives from the word husn, which designates the quality of being good and beautiful. Dictionaries tell us that husn means in general every positive quality, goodness, goodliness, beauty, harmony. So once we submit to God, it has to lead to beauty. It has to lead to harmony, not the ugliness of violence and destruction. The word jihad, now, in its essence, is derived from the root jahada, which is about toiling, which is about exerting oneself, which is about meditating upon a thing, or striving or struggling against difficulties. And Razi, who is one of the great leading commentators of the Quran, argues that there is nothing in the word to indicate that this striving is to be affected by the sword. So in its essence, the word is about struggling. It's about striving for that state. The Prophet defined ihsan as to worship God as if you see him. If you do not see him, know that he sees you. So how do we get to that state? And we get to that state through a real striving, striving against, and this is what touches on the real essence of jihad for every Muslim who lives out the Islamic way of life. Coming back from an expedition, the Prophet said, you have come with the best coming, you have come from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. And the companions were perplexed, and they said, well, we thought we were doing the greater jihad. What's the greater jihad? And the Prophet said, the servant's struggle against his or her ego. And these are some of the verses from the Quran. Those who exert themselves, jahada, who strive, do so for their own benefit. Because God, of course, doesn't need us. We need him. And we shall certainly blot out the misdeeds of those who believe and do good deeds. And we shall reward them according to the best ihsana of their actions. The other verse, but we shall be sure to guide to our ways those who strive hard for our cause. God is with those who do good. The al-mu'sinin, those whose habit, whose life is about doing that which is beautiful. And struggle, jahidhum, against them with it, that is the Quran, a great striving. So jihadun kabirun, which is a great striving, great jihad. And this is in Mecca, when the Muslims are being persecuted. And this is a revelation that says, argue with people who are persecuting you, not to resort to violence and so on. So really, if you take that principle, it's in any society. It's about argument. I think we were talking about arguments and ideas. And in fact, I would say that the battle against extremism today in Islam is a battle of ideas. Do we want a group of people who want to impose their will on their fellow Muslims and far too often justify their violence against their fellow Muslims? Or do we want something that nourishes the heart? You know, and this is what the greater jihad is about. And these are some of the hadith. The mujahid is he who makes jihad against his nafs, his ego, for the sake of obeying God. The most excellent jihad is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, the annual pilgrimage. But the pilgrimage, the Hajj is, I'm sure you will all know, if one is able to, if one is physically able to financially able to, one makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, and also the resting place of the Prophet, may Allah bless him, in Medina. And the other one, a wonderful tradition about a man who wants to go in jihad, and the Prophet says, have you parents? The Prophet said, well, your jihad is serve your parents. And sometimes when I'm called into schools and have one-to-one interaction with young Muslims who are just seeing are being drawn into an extremist narrative, I say to them, look, serve your parents, serve your own local community. There is so much that you can do here. It's absurd. It just doesn't make sense that you want to travel thousands of miles to go and fight and so on. But that kind of gives you a flavor of what we're talking about, jihad. This is the lived out experience of the Muslim on a daily basis, not this political vision that dresses itself up in religious language. So the greater jihad, it's to cultivate virtue such as prayer, sincerity, humility, forgiveness, love, generosity. Why is it that when we speak about Islam, that all of this is cut out? Because the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, I've been sent to perfect your character. If what you do is ugly and violent, then to what extent is that reflecting what the Prophet has taught us? To struggle against one's selfish desires. Getting up in the morning for prayer. The days in summer are very short. Sometimes I stay up at night, do my work at night, pray my morning prayer. To fast in the month of Ramadan. The Prophet also said to love for your brother what you love for yourself. That's asking us to place the other person before ourselves. And to what extent do we do that? So I think, the whole purpose about this presentation really is to show you that the Islamic dimension of Islam has been completely neglected in RE. And if you neglect the heart of a religion, then what you will have is people who are illiterate about their own religion, who are more susceptible to being drawn into violence and extremism and so on. I think, Deborah, I shall end there, and then we can have a further conversation. Yeah, fire away. Yes, I'll do my best. I've actually lost some hearing, so in case I don't hear it, Deborah, I'll resort to you. But
We'll do it 3 ways.
sure, okay, sure. It's age, I'm afraid. So.
Any questions you want to ask Manawar?
Amira.
Hi. This is great to hear, and ironically, I think for those of us who represent the Ismaili community here, I think we would have taken jihad and given almost the same presentation. So it's nice to see that.
Yeah.
How much do you think the Islamic dimension is understood by Muslims in Britain today, and how much do you think Muslims from different cultural traditions and different backgrounds would agree with what you said here?
I think that's an excellent point. To what extent would the majority of Muslims subscribe to that in Britain? That's roughly your or be aware of it. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a really profound question as well, because we've come to where we are today in terms of Islam and Muslims because of a 200-year history, a history that begins in the 18th century. There's a movement that emerges in Najd, in the current day Saudi Arabia, which is very literalist. It's extreme, and it's very advocates what we call takfir, which is excommunicating fellow Muslims, and so that process has led us to where we are today. I would say that the vast majority, of Muslims will resonate with them. But there are, of course, going to be those Muslims who just hate the idea of Sufism, which is at the heart of the Islamic tradition, which they find troubling, because I think confidence, spiritual confidence, makes you inclusive. My teacher, for example, has a wonderful maxim that the other is my brother, and he uses, I think, in commentary, Sayyidina Ali, who says that the other is in my brother either in humanity or in Islam. Yeah, but we're.
Your brother in religion or you like in creation.
Yeah, so we're all kind of part of the same family, and so this is something that's been neglected, and that this kind of takes us onto a political step, because what we have manifesting today has had tens of billions pumped into it. So what was the Ku Klux Klan version of Islam has had so much money put into it that it's now become conflated with the tradition itself. So I think this is something that we have to recover. It's there. I'm so pleased that there are communities still here who follow that path of Islam. But we need to recover that. We need to recapture that. And I take the view that it's the Islam that we need for the 21st century, not one that's dressed up in politics, but uses religious language.
I just wanted to ask about the failure of our educational endeavors to differentiate between or to understand the extremism. What I mean by this is that if we look at those who travel to join ISIS, the extremist groups, many of them are teenagers who left their schools, 15 years old or 16 years old. Now, most of them were radicalized at a later stage, and it was done very quickly through social media. To what extent do we understand the propaganda, the mechanism through which this is being communicated to them, and what are our counter actions to respond to this? Because I think it's critical.
Yeah. Did everyone hear that? Yeah, it's a very good question in terms of ISIS and how its narrative is attracting young people, and what we do to combat that. Roughly, is the gist of what you've.
Yes.
Is that right? Have I got that right?
It's just, first of all, do we understand how do they approach, how do they attract these people,
Sure.
these students?
Sure.
And what are we doing about it? What should we do?
Yeah. Well, I began a program. I'm also a Muslim tutor at Eton College, and I began a program in 2004. That I developed at Eton, and then I brought it out to a local school, a secondary school in Oxford, in 2008. And because even then I knew that young people, Muslims, were accessing material on the internet, which was kind of shaping their thinking, but they had no space to be able to discuss that. So what we did was create a space within a school where young Muslims can come and sit and talk. And so that program is what I call the Oxford Muslim Pupils Empowerment Program. It can be easily downloaded from the internet. And that's what we need in terms of young people having someone who understands the faith and unpicks the narrative of extremists. That's absolutely essential. The other thing is, I think there's a schizophrenic mindset within the Muslim community. This is our country, this is where we belong, and this is where our loyalties lie, and this is where we should do all we can to serve, to give something back. That's what Islam asks us. What are we going to do for our neighbor? What are we going to do for our local community and our society? And I think we haven't been clear about that. And that's enabled extremists to alienate young people from mainstream society and from their own families and their own communities. And then they become more susceptible to these extremist messages. But I don't think it's just social media. I think there is something going on within certain segments of Islamic community which isn't giving the right message. And that enables them to be drawn. It's absurd that people have to go 1,000 miles to jihad. What, killing each other is jihad? I mean, that's preposterous. I mean, if you, the Prophet ﷺ said, the one who kills a Muslim and the one, both will go to Jahannam, So, yeah. Could you just speak up a bit?
There's a wide spectrum of beliefs within Islam. There's a wide
based on two
group of
science and desserts.
I really, how do we get an understanding of the spectrum? Like, because I always hear that there's not just Shia and Sunni, there's there's all these things. You don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's, first things first. I mean, in terms of Sunni Shia, the violence that's coming from is not, it's not Sunni. People are reluctant to say this, but it's actually Puritan Wahhabism. Because they used to go 200 years ago to Basra and kill Shia, because they consider the Shia not Muslim. Mainstream Ahl-Sunnah consider Shia as Muslim as well. We recognize we have differences. We do not do takfir on our fellow Muslims. And I think there's a wonderful document called the Aman Message. We should be disseminating that, because scholars from across the Islamic world came together and said, who is a Muslim? What is going on? That Muslims are killing each other and saying that this person's non-Muslim, and then we do violence to them. So the Aman Message came together and said, look, this is a broad church. We have differences. We recognize that. But there is no justification for violence against each other. So it's a very broad definition of who a Muslim is. And I'd recommend that. Aman Message, AMMAN. It's very accessible. You can go to the Oxford Foundation, which is something I set up in 2009, theoxfordfoundation.com. And you can download all of these documents there. It's all done, but it's how do we get that kind of knowledge down to young people? Because I felt that, the reason my work is based around schools is because I don't want it to be sectarian. I want young people to understand how we've got to where we are, and they recognize that what is authentic and what is not authentic. Actually, what is anti-Islamic. Garbed up as Islamic. Ladies first, sorry. Ladies first, okay.
All right, thanks very much.
All right, then.
I really enjoyed it, what you've been saying about the more Islamic elements to Islam and your re-emphasis, this idea that jihad is more of an inner struggle, and I certainly marries with the teaching that I've tried to give in my class. I'm concerned that there is a historical element to jihad that is underrepresented and undertaught. And in the same way that I think it's right in the teaching of Christianity that Christians deal with crusades and the Spanish Inquisition and elements of their own history perhaps that they are less fond of talking about, that perhaps there is an element of Islam between the 7th and the 14th centuries that needs to be dealt with if we are to really expose some of the historical and less more challenging aspects of jihad, and what are the connotations of that word?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's been an underplay of the real jihad, which is about war and so on, as opposed to the greater jihad. I take the view, as I mentioned in my initial observation, which was to say that Islam also is not a pacifist religion. Yeah, it's not. It has a clear conduct when it relates to war. Now, the person who has the right to declare war is not some bloke sitting in a cave in Afghanistan or some chap in East London saying, I declare jihad. That's to make a mockery of a great religion and a great civilization. Yeah? So, who declares war is question number one. And it's the executive always that declares the war, okay? So each country, whatever system they have, it's the ruler who, it's the executive who decides. So there are clear rules of conduct in war and when war is to be conducted, yeah? Most Muslim scholars say it's defensive. It's defensive because the weapons that we have today destroy life. They burn human beings. And that's objectionable to us as Muslims because it's against the principles that Islam gives us. Yeah? So therefore, in the modern age, it's a defensive war. The problem I think we have is that we're looking at jihad as if it's 7th century, 10th century, but we're not living in 7th century or 10th century. We're living in the 21st century. So the laws and the principles that we have must relate to today. So Muslim, for example, in Islam, the Sharia, very clear. States will have covenants and treaties and relationships. Individuals are citizens of countries. And it's obligatory for Muslims to obey the covenants or live out the covenants, not to break a covenant or any treaty. So whether it's nation states, so for example, we have United Nations. If it's effective, it should be resolving all the conflicts that we have. I hope that makes sense to you. So we're not, but remember, when Muslims conducted war, and I think we have some of the wonderful, are they the sheets that we developed, Deborah? We have some of the quotes when Sayyidina Umar, Muslims conquered Jerusalem, giving the Christians, their rights to practice their religion, as they felt fit. So what I'm saying is there's a kind of disconnect. When we talk about jihad, we're looking at 7th, 8th century, but we're saying that we're not living in 7th, 8th century, so we have to kind of take those principles, and that's what Muslim scholars have done.
Can we take those questions at the end? We've got double questions. Can I do my bit now?
Yes, of course. That was more than 15 minutes, I think.
I know. I like listening to you. Thank you to Monowar, and he's not going to escape. Go and rest your legs. You need to rest your legs. Just to say thank you, Monowar. And what I'm going to try to do now is just to say a little bit about how I teach jihad. I've been teaching for 30 years in an area which is the majority of the pupils are Muslim. And what I've watched over that period is that their knowledge and understanding of their own tradition has got weaker and weaker and weaker overall. I obviously have some students who come in who are incredibly well informed about the tradition, but they are now becoming much more rare. And it's, why is that happening? Well, there are lots of reasons why that's happening, and I could probably talk for about half an hour about that. But the bottom line is, when people tell us as teachers, well, you don't need to teach Muslims about Islam, do you? I throw up my hands in horror. Because actually, they need to know just as much as the others. They come with great questions, and that then puts you guys in a really difficult position, because if you're teaching a school like mine, and you've got the responsibility of answering questions from Muslim students, you feel sometimes under quite a lot of strain, because you've got to make sure your subject knowledge is really up. And I learned very quickly that magical phrase, I don't know now, but I'll find out for you for next lesson. And I think the more we are honest about the fact that we don't know everything, rather than try to wing it, the more successful our religious education will be, and the more integrity we'll have as teachers. So never, ever be afraid of saying, I don't know now, and I'll find out. And that's where Monowar and many of my other, the many Muslim friends that I've built up over the years are invaluable if I can't find the source. But you can imagine my bookshelf now is looking rather heavily Islamic. So, in terms of teaching about jihad, there's obviously what Monowar has been talking about is both greater and lesser jihad, but many of the issues that we're getting at the moment are about the lesser jihad. But we mustn't forget the greater jihad, because it is the greater jihad. And what I put on the screen is a very simple activity that I've done with students, which is basically to look at the different types of jihad. You've got going from right to left in true Islamic fashion, jihad of the hand, jihad of the heart, and you can see all these other different jihad, all these different types of jihad that Islam recognises. And that's a really useful way in, because if you try to ask students what it means to strive to be a better person, it's quite abstract. But if you actually start talking about how you can strive to be a better person in terms of with your hands, how you in terms of your heart, and you can actually get a much better understanding from them. So I have this activity where they match up the definitions with those words. I've got another sheet as well. I don't know if it will go through. Will it click through? No, it won't go through. Never mind. But the other thing I do is I have a picture of a person's body, and I label it with the heart, the hand, and so on. And I get them to actually think about how they would strive to make themselves a better person with those different aspects. And so that's one thing I do. But of course, the great need seems to be to get them to help them to understand about the lesser jihad. And so I'm going to get you to do an activity, because you've been sitting there for far too long. And I think, I know Julia's going to hate me for this, because I need you probably to move away from these chairs to work. And I'm going to give you a sheet. And on this sheet, it shows you some of the rules, if you like, the conditions in which jihad can be declared. And this is really so important that students understand that jihad, as Monowar said, can't just be declared by any random person that happens to not like somebody else, or even some random group that don't appreciate another group. It has to be declared under very strict rules, and they are set out in the Quran and the Hadith very, very clearly. Now, my students I've taught them not to believe people that just say, you must do this because your religion says so, or not even you must do this because the Quran says so. I've taught them to come back to me every time anybody says that to them and say, where? Where in the Quran does it say this? Where in the Hadith? Which Hadith? Are you sure it's an authentic Hadith? And I train them to do that, and it's a really important thing you do that they actually know where in the Quran, because people are so fond. My school's a girls' school, so very fond of telling people what their Muslim women's duties are, but can't always find them in the Quran. Somehow their brothers sometimes do that. Interesting. So where in the Quran is it? And so on. As they go up the school, we also teach them a little bit about Quranic exegesis. In other words, we teach them to ask things like, well, what was going on in Mecca or in Medina at the time that verse was revealed? Are there any other verses in the Quran that talk about that same topic? Monowar mentioned about abrogation. So over time, did that verse get abrogated by another verse? The classic one you can do. Look at the verses on alcohol. Very interesting to see how one verse is abrogated by another. Quite fun to do that in the lesson, actually, when you're looking and saying there's verses in the Quran that actually suggest that you can drink alcohol. So use those different techniques to get them to think about a holy book is not just a proof text. It's not something you pick up and just take a verse and just apply it. So teaching them those things. So I'm going to give you these cards, and I'm going to give you an envelope with some verses of the Quran, and my very able assistant. How many are there? 6. So I think you're going to be in groups of about 5 or 6. And you could go to the comfy chairs if you want. So there's a nice little comfy chair over there. And all you're going to do is you're going to sort the cards out to show which ones give evidence for each of these categories. Right, okay, so do you want to take one group over there, one group over there? Do you want to make a little bundle in the corner over there, maybe over here, and groups of 5 or 6? I grab those comfy chairs as well. We have our second section of question and answer now. Right, thank you very much for doing that exercise. I think you probably worked out that one of the challenges of it is the language of the Quran. And what I tend to do with the younger students is to paraphrase the words of the Quran on those cards. So the Quran surah, definitely put the references, whatever surah it is, surah 2183 says, and then just paraphrase it into the kind of language you know they understand. The activity still works just as well. And I know that there's quite a lot of websites you can use to get different translations of the Quran, some which are easier than the others. I was using Quran.com, and Monawar likes altafsir.com.
Altafsir.com, altafsir.com. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic website because it's got lots of different translations, but it also has commentaries. It has commentaries from classical Muslim scholars, but it also has esoteric commentaries from some great Sufis. So, and it's all free. And it's all in English. It's ALTAFS for sugar, IR.com. Sorry.
And the thing that's really interesting about it as well is when you pull down the selections, you can have both Sunni and Shia sources, which is really great because that allows you, particularly if you're working at GCSE at A level, you'll notice that there's much more requirement now to learn about Sunni and Shia traditions. So you've got sources there and you'll become familiar with those, which is really helpful to you as a teacher. So in our last 5 minutes, I just wanted to ask if you had any further questions for either Monawar or myself. That would be fine.
I think it's quite useful to reiterate to the students that we're teaching this topic and selective references is that when you're talking about Lesser Jihad, it's quite interesting to note that in the 21 years of the Prophet's ministry, only 3 months was spent in Lesser Jihad. It's a very small percentage of anything all his life. So I think it's important to explain the context of those verses. That was a very minor part of his ministry itself.
Did everybody hear what was said? The speaker said that we should note that actually in the 21 years of the Prophet's ministry, only 3 months of it was involved in lesser jihad, which is quite an important point to make. Yes.
Just quickly, I'm really gratified to have this topic today because there's Heathrow College, we're going to host a three-way Christian, Jewish and Islamic conference on jihad. And it's not happening for security reasons. And it just strikes me, that is there scope also for the theology of jihad, the lesser jihad, Dabiq, you know, the idea is ISIS have taken Dabiq, which is a bit like Armageddon for Christians, etc., etc. And understanding the theology of that. Is there any scope for doing that? Maybe even at A level. Just like understanding, for example, as a Catholic, I would not want like you said, the Ku Klux Klan or fundamentalist Armageddon type understanding of the end of the world being what
hijacked.
Me.
Yeah.
Hijacked. But is it necessary to some extent to know that so you can recognise it as fundamentalist? And then whether you're Muslim or whatever you are, Christian, whatever, you can say, well, I know where they're coming from, but that's not the majority opinion.
Okay, Monawar will be very humble about this, but he has done a magnificent thing and a magnificently brave thing, I have to say, as well, in publishing a document, an open letter to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. And in that open letter, I don't know how long it took him and his colleagues to do this. He has gone through every aspect of that narrative and shown exactly where it comes from in terms of Islam and why it's not accurate. And he'll say some more about it himself, but it's fairly long. But if you want a theological induction into what Greater and Lesser Jihad is, largely what Lesser Jihad is, read that letter. It's available on the web, very easy to find. I'll put it in the references to this document, and at that point I should say all this stuff as well is going to be available for you to download, so don't worry about that. Go.
I'm not going to take credit for that, for the open letter totally. I mean, I'm a signatory to it. I'm very proud to be a signatory to it because I think this extremist, sort of theology or interpretation of Islam is anti-Islamic. Yeah, it's not just, it's just anti-Islamic. It's against the principles of Islam. And the open letter you can download at theoxfordfoundation.com. There are many learned people who are signatories to that. They're the ones who've done tremendous work. 126 in total from across the Sunni world. So these are Sunni scholars who are not just regular Joes like me who are students of the religion, but muftis, real, high-standing people in Sunni Islam who've endorsed that. What I'm trying to do, I mean, I've sent it to loads of people. Apart from, like the PM acknowledging it sort of 6 months ago and saying he's giving it consideration, which now I understand means it's sort of filed away and nothing's going to be done about it. Many people are not acknowledging it because of precisely what you've said, because of fear. Do we want to live in fear? That's the question, because, we have a wonderful country, and I think we have to stand up for certain core values. And as a Muslim, I believe this is my kind of contribution with a whole host of other people. But the key thing is, how do we get that message into schools, colleges, and universities? That's the key. Otherwise, it just becomes another initiative that doesn't go to the grassroots level. Now, what we're doing on the 20th of May at University of Birmingham is I have another initiative called United for Peace, Communities United Against Extremism, because we're not just talking about religious extremists, we're also talking about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, a whole host of far-right groups who want to rip apart and tear apart our society. And they hate the idea that we can all sit together, respect each other, and live as good neighbors. Yeah? So on the 20th of May, the idea is to have a service, but also to launch the open letter, but get Muslim community leaders in Birmingham to endorse the open letter, and also to persuade imams in mosques to deliver sermons on it. If we can get that right, we want to go to other cities and do the same thing. I think that's what needs to happen to marginalize this very minority voice who just seems to monopolize our television screens.
So on that really positive note, I have to say thank you so much to Monowar for speaking about this today.
Thank you.